It was a warm Saturday morning when a tired single mother pushed open the glass doors of Olson Luxury Motors. Her beige dress was neat, but faded, the fabric worn thin from too many wash cycles. Her white sneakers had scuff marks that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Clutching her 6-year-old daughter's hand, she whispered softly, "We're just here to look, baby. I want you to see something beautiful." The showroom gleamed under brilliant overhead lights. Sleek sports cars sat like jewels on the polished marble floor, a Ferrari, a Bentley, a Porsche. The air smelled of new leather and expensive cologne. Customers in designer sunglasses strolled casually between the vehicles, their watches catching the light. But the moment Kimberly stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Bonnie Jones, a sharp young saleswoman in a tailored navy suit, noticed them first. Her eyes traveled slowly from Kimberly's scuffed sneakers to her faded dress, then down to Ava's worn sandals. She nudged the colleague beside her. A smirk spread across her glossy lips. "Can I help you?" Bonnie called out, her voice dripping with mock politeness, loud enough for everyone to hear. Kimberly smiled gently, keeping her composure. "Just browsing. My daughter loves cars." Bonnie tilted her head, voice laced with condescension. "Sweetheart, these cars start at 6 figures. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at a used lot?" Quiet laughter rippled through the showroom. A couple in matching designer coats exchanged amused glances. One of the male employees muttered something to another, both chuckling behind their hands. People like her don't shop here. Did she seriously think she could afford anything? Security should keep an eye on her. Kimberly's face flushed hot with shame. She held Ava's hand tighter, pretending not to hear. But the whispers grew louder, sharper, cutting deeper with every passing second. Ava tugged at her mother's dress, her small voice trembling. "Mommy, why are they looking at us like that?" Kimberly knelt down, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. With a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she whispered, "Sometimes people don't understand us, sweetheart, but that doesn't mean we don't belong here." But before she could stand, another voice sliced through the air. "Ma'am, if you're not here to make a purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're making the other customers uncomfortable." It was Bonnie again, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line of disdain. Before we get started, don't forget to give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us bring you even more incredible stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into the story. Kimberly swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She rose slowly, squeezing Ava's hand. "We'll just be quick," she said quietly, though her voice wavered. Ava looked up at her mother, eyes glassy with confusion. "It's okay, Mommy. We can go. I don't want them to be mean to you." That single sentence, spoken with the pure, heartbreaking innocence of a child, pierced deeper than any insult. Ava didn't care about the cars. She just didn't want her mother to hurt. But the mockery didn't stop. One salesman leaned toward another and muttered, "Should we call security? This is getting embarrassing." Kimberly's chest tightened. Every glance felt like a knife. Every whisper felt like a judgment on her worth as a mother, as a person. She wanted to turn around and run, to shield her daughter from this cruelty. But she refused. Because this was supposed to be a special Saturday, a moment of hope, a chance to show Ava that dreams weren't reserved for the wealthy. And just when the humiliation became unbearable, a deep, commanding voice echoed from the back of the showroom. "What's going on here?" The chatter stopped. The laughter died. Every head turned. A tall, well-dressed man in an impeccable charcoal suit strode across the marble floor, his footsteps sharp and purposeful. His presence commanded instant silence. Albert Olson, the owner himself. Bonnie straightened immediately, smoothing her blazer. "Sir, this woman doesn't belong here. She's disrupting our clients." Albert's gaze shifted. His eyes landed on Kimberly, and for a long, breathless moment, he simply stared. His expression was unreadable. He looked past the faded dress, past the scuffed shoes, past the shame in her eyes. And then something flickered across his face. Recognition. His brow furrowed. His steps slowed. His eyes widened just slightly. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "It can't be her." The staff exchanged confused glances. Kimberly stood frozen, her daughter's hand still clasped tightly in hers, unsure whether things were about to get worse. But Albert's memory was racing backward, years ago, before the fortune, before the dealership, before any of this existed. Back to a cold night outside a diner, back to when he was nobody. Back to the moment a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile handed him a plate of food and said, "Everyone deserves a second chance." Now, standing in his glittering showroom, surrounded by wealth and prestige, Albert Olson realized that the woman his staff had just mocked was the very person who had once saved his life. But to understand how a single act of kindness could change everything, we need to go back. Back to when Albert Olson wasn't the owner of a luxury dealership. Back to when he had nothing but a broken-down car, an empty stomach, and a dream that seemed impossible. Yet that memory hadn't surfaced yet. Not while Albert was still outside, sliding his Bentley into his reserved spot, checking his watch, preparing for another routine Saturday at the dealership. Inside, the humiliation continued. Ava's wide eyes wandered across the showroom, drinking in the impossible beauty of the cars around her. Despite the tension crackling through the air, despite the whispers and stares, she was still just a little girl. And these cars were magic. Her gaze landed on a sleek red Ferrari positioned near the center of the showroom, bathed in a pool of golden light from the skylight above. The paint gleamed like liquid fire, every curve sculpted to perfection. "Mommy," Ava breathed, her voice filled with wonder. Before Kimberly could stop her, Ava had drifted forward, her small orange dress swaying as she moved. She approached the Ferrari slowly, reverently, as if approaching something sacred. Then, with the pure innocence only a child possesses, she reached out and pressed both palms against the polished hood. "Mommy, it looks like fire!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up with the brightest smile Kimberly had seen all day. "It's so pretty." For just 1 second, Kimberly's heart lifted. This was why she'd come, to see that light in her daughter's eyes. But the moment shattered instantly. "Hey!" One of the male salesmen straightened from across the room, his voice sharp with alarm. "She's touching the merchandise!" Heads snapped in their direction. Bonnie appeared beside them like a hawk swooping on prey, her heels clicking against the marble with aggressive precision. "Please, keep your child from touching the cars," Bonnie said sharply, her voice loud enough to draw every eye in the showroom. "These are worth more than some people's houses." The emphasis on some people was deliberate, cruel. A few customers nearby exchanged knowing looks. One woman whispered to her husband behind a manicured hand. Another man shook his head slowly, as if witnessing something distasteful. The words hit Kimberly like a slap across the face. Her chest tightened. Heat rushed to her cheeks. She gently took Ava's hand and pulled her back from the car. "It's okay," Honey, Kimberly whispered, her voice strained but soft. Let's just look from here. Ava's small face crumpled. The light that had been there moments ago dimmed like a candle blown out. She looked up at her mother with confused, glistening eyes. Did we do something bad, Mommy? That question broke something inside Kimberly. She knelt down quickly, cupping Ava's face in her hands, brushing away the beginnings of tears with her thumb. No, sweetheart, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady, even as her own eyes burned. You didn't do anything wrong. Some people just forget to be kind. Behind them, she heard it, the quiet laughter, the murmured comments. Can you believe she brought her kid in here? Poor car. Hope she didn't scratch it. Where do they think they are? Every word was a needle. Every glance was a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Kimberly felt small, invisible, worthless. But even as shame threatened to crush her, something deeper stirred inside. A stubborn, quiet defiance. She refused to leave. Not yet. Not like this. Because if she left now, Ava would remember this moment forever. She'd remember being told she didn't belong. That dreams were only for certain people. That touching something beautiful was forbidden for girls like her. And Kimberly wouldn't let that be the lesson her daughter learned today. So she stood, slowly, and took Ava's hand again. She lifted her chin just slightly and kept her gaze forward. Let's look at the others, Kimberly said gently, guiding Ava away from the Ferrari. Ava nodded silently, clutching her mother's hand like a lifeline, her earlier excitement replaced with a quiet sadness that no 6-year-old should ever have to feel. Bonnie watched them move away with a satisfied smirk, turning back to her colleagues. Some people really don't know their place, she muttered loud enough for Kimberly to hear. The other employees nodded in agreement. One even chuckled. Across the showroom, a well-dressed customer leaned toward his wife. Poor judgment on their part. If you can't afford it, why torture yourself? His wife hummed in agreement, adjusting her Hermes bag. Kimberly felt every stare, every judgment, every ounce of disdain radiating from the people around her. But she didn't run. She held her daughter's hand and walked with quiet dignity past the rows of gleaming vehicles, the Porsche, the Bentley, the Aston Martin, each one a monument to wealth she'd never possess, each one a reminder of how the world saw her. Yet still, she stayed, because her daughter deserved to stand among dreams, even for one day, even if it hurt, even if the world told them they didn't belong. Outside, beyond the glass walls of the showroom, a black Bentley pulled smoothly into the owner's reserved parking space. Albert Olson stepped out, adjusting his tie and checking his watch. Saturday mornings at the dealership were usually routine. Walk the floor, check in with the team, maybe close a deal or two. He locked the car with a soft beep and strode toward the entrance, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement. Through the tinted glass, he could see movement inside. Customers browsing, salespeople hovering. Everything appeared normal. He had no idea that inside, at that very moment, the woman who once saved his life was standing among his staff, being humiliated, judged, and mocked. He had no idea that the little girl in the orange dress pressing her face wistfully against the window of a Porsche was the daughter of the person who'd given him hope when he had none. He pushed open the glass doors, stepping into the cool, air-conditioned showroom, and everything was about to change. The atmosphere in the showroom curdled with elitist cruelty. Albert stepped inside, nodding briefly to the receptionist at the front desk. The familiar hum of the dealership, muted conversations, the soft jazz playing overhead, the scent of leather and luxury, greeted him like any other Saturday. But something felt off. There was tension in the air. A charge. The kind that comes when people are watching something unfold. He moved deeper into the showroom, his trained eyes scanning the floor. Sales teams clustered near the Porsches. Customers browsed the McLaren display. Everything looked normal. Except for the group gathered near the center, their attention fixed on something or someone. Bonnie stood with her arms crossed, leaning close to Marcus, one of the senior salesmen. Her voice was low, but edged with amusement, just loud enough to be overheard by anyone nearby. "We should call security before she starts asking for test drives," Bonnie muttered, tilting her head toward Kimberly and Ava. Marcus smirked, glancing over at the mother and daughter standing awkwardly near the SUV section. "Maybe she's here for pictures, free memories of the rich life." They both laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. A younger employee, Tyler, joined them, curiosity lighting his face. "What's going on?" "Oh, nothing," Bonnie said with mock sweetness. "Just some charity case wandering around like she owns the place." Tyler glanced at Kimberly, then back at Bonnie. "Should we, I don't know, do something?" "Like what?" Marcus said, shrugging. "She hasn't stolen anything yet, but give it time." More laughter rippled through the small group. Kimberly heard every word. Her back was turned to them, but sound carried easily across the marble floor. Each syllable landed like a stone against her chest. Charity case. Stolen. Free memories. Her cheeks burned hot with shame. Her throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to tell them they had no right to judge her. But she didn't, because Ava was watching. And if Kimberly broke now, if she let them see her cry, if she let the cruelty win, then Ava would remember this moment as the day her mother crumbled under the weight of the world's judgment. So instead, Kimberly forced a soft smile and knelt down beside her daughter. "We'll look at one more car, okay?" she said gently, brushing a curl from Ava's forehead. Ava nodded quietly, her earlier excitement long gone. She clung to her mother's hand, her small fingers wrapped tight around Kimberly's palm. Kimberly led Ava toward the luxury SUVs. The Range Rovers, the Cadillac Escalades, the Mercedes G-Wagons. These weren't flashy sports cars. They were practical, family-sized, the kind of vehicle she dreamed of one day owning. A safe car, a reliable car, a car that could take Ava to school, hold groceries, carry them through life's everyday moments. One day, Kimberly thought, one day, when I've saved enough, when things are better. But even here, among the SUVs, she felt the weight of disdainful eyes following her every move. A couple browsing nearby noticed her and subtly moved away, as if poverty were contagious. An older salesman glanced at her, then quickly looked away, clearly uninterested in wasting his time on someone who, obviously, couldn't afford anything. Every step felt heavier. Every glance felt like a judgment. Ava stood beside a black Range Rover, staring up at it with quiet awe. "Mommy, this one's big," she whispered. "It is," Kimberly said softly, resting a hand on Ava's shoulder. "Big enough for all our adventures." Ava looked up at her mother, her small face thoughtful. "Will we have a car like this one day?" Kimberly's heart squeezed. She smiled, even though it hurt. "Maybe one day, baby." But even as she said it, the doubt crept in. The whispers from across the room echoed louder than her hope. In the corner, near the executive offices, Albert stood motionless. He'd been watching, not openly, not obviously, but his gaze had landed on the woman in the faded beige dress and the little girl in orange, and something about them held his attention. He watched the way Kimberly moved, carefully, quietly, as if trying not to disturb the air around her. He watched the way she bent down to comfort her daughter, the gentle way she brushed the child's hair, the soft words she whispered, and he watched the way his staff treated her. The smirks, the whispers, the barely concealed disdain. Albert's jaw tightened. This wasn't what he'd built this dealership for. This wasn't the culture he thought he'd created. But more than that, something about the woman seemed familiar. He couldn't place it, couldn't pinpoint the memory, but it tugged at the edges of his mind like a forgotten song. Her face, the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity in her posture despite the humiliation surrounding her. I know her. The thought surfaced unbidden, insistent. I know that face. Albert signaled to his assistant Jessica, a sharp young woman who handled schedules and logistics. She hurried over, tablet in hand. Yes, Mr. Olson. Albert nodded toward Kimberly. Who is that woman? Jessica glanced over, her expression neutral. No idea, sir. Probably someone lost. She paused, then added with a slight shrug, Bonnie said she's been browsing for a while, but hasn't asked about financing or anything. Doesn't seem like a serious buyer. Albert didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Kimberly. Jessica shifted, unsure. Should I have someone escort her out? No, Albert said quietly, his tone firm. No, just leave her be. Jessica nodded, though confusion flickered across her face. Of course, sir. She walked away, leaving Albert standing alone. He couldn't shake the feeling. That face, those eyes, the gentle way she comforted her daughter. Where do I know you from? The question burned in his mind, but the answer remained just out of reach, buried somewhere in the years behind him. Across the showroom, Kimberly straightened and took Ava's hand again. Come on, sweetheart, she said softly. Let's go. She'd had enough. The dream had turned into a nightmare, and she couldn't subject Ava to any more of this. But just as she turned toward the door, Excuse me? A deep, steady voice cut through the air. Kimberly froze. She turned slowly, and for the first time, her eyes met Albert Olson's. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, standing face to face, something clicked, for both of them. The memory wasn't clear yet, not fully formed, but it hovered there, just beneath the surface, waiting to break through. Albert's brow furrowed slightly. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, and Kimberly's breath caught, because she recognized him too. The humiliation had finally worn her down. Kimberly felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Every whisper, every glance, every cruel word had piled on top of the last until she couldn't carry it anymore. She squeezed Ava's hand gently and whispered, Come on, baby, let's go. Ava looked up at her mother, her small face etched with sadness. She didn't argue, didn't ask why. She simply nodded, her earlier wonder replaced with a quiet understanding that they didn't belong here. They turned toward the glass doors, toward the sunlight beyond, toward the world where they fit, where worn sneakers and faded dresses didn't invite judgment. But they weren't allowed to leave with dignity. You see, sweetheart? Bonnie's voice rang out across the showroom, sharp and mocking. She called after them with exaggerated sweetness. "Dreaming's free, just don't get too close." Laughter erupted from the cluster of employees behind her. Marcus snorted. "Brutal, Bonnie." Tyler shook his head, grinning. "Cold, but fair." Even a few customers smirked, amused by the spectacle. Kimberly's steps faltered. Her shoulders tensed. The words stung worse than all the others combined, because they weren't just aimed at her. They were aimed at Ava, at her daughter's innocent hope. She wanted to turn around, to say something, to defend herself and her child. But her voice wouldn't come. Instead, she kept walking, her grip on Ava's hand tightening as tears threatened to spill. Albert stood near the entrance, frozen. He'd been about to step onto the floor, to greet his team, to check in on the morning's progress. But Bonnie's voice, loud, cruel, deliberate, cut through the air like a blade. And then he heard the other voice, soft, calm, quiet. "Come on, baby, let's go." It was barely more than a whisper, but it reached him. And something in that voice, in the gentle, weary cadence of those words, hit him like a freight train. His breath caught. His heart stuttered. The world around him blurred. The memory came flooding back, unbidden, unstoppable. Rain, heavy, relentless rain pounding against cracked pavement. The smell of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. The sound of thunder rolling across the sky. A broken-down Toyota Corolla on the side of the highway, hood popped open, steam rising from the engine, and a young man sitting on the curb beside it, head in his hands, drenched to the bone. That man was Albert, 10 years ago, maybe more. Back when he was nobody, back when he had nothing but a worthless car, an eviction notice, and a dream that felt like a cruel joke. He'd been sitting there for hours, watching cars pass by, watching people glance at him and keep driving. No one stopped. No one cared. He was invisible. Until she stopped. A beat-up Honda Civic pulled over, hazard lights flashing. The door opened, and a young woman stepped out, early 20s, wearing a waitress uniform with a coffee stain on the apron. She jogged over, shielding her eyes from the rain. "Hey, you okay?" Albert looked up, soaked and defeated. "My car died. I don't have money for a tow." The woman glanced at the broken-down Corolla, then back at him. She didn't hesitate. "Come on," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let's get you out of this rain." "It's fine," she interrupted gently. "I'm not leaving you out here." She drove him to a diner, bought him coffee and a hot meal, sat across from him while he ate, not judging, not pitying, just kind. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she'd told him that night, her eyes warm and sincere. "Don't let life convince you otherwise." He'd asked her name. "Kimberly," she'd said with a tired smile. "Kimberly Robinson." He never forgot it, and he never forgot what she did for him. She didn't just give him a meal, she gave him hope. She reminded him that he was worth something, that he mattered. That night changed his life. He fixed his car. He got back on his feet. He worked harder than he ever had before. He fought for every opportunity, every break, every step forward. And eventually, he built this dealership. Everything he had, the success, the wealth, the prestige, started with that one act of kindness from a waitress in a stained apron who saw him as human when the rest of the world didn't. Albert's eyes snapped back to the present. His heart pounded in his chest. He stared at the woman walking toward the exit, the faded beige dress, the scuffed sneakers, the little girl in orange clinging to her hand. That voice, that face, it was her. After all these years, after all this time, Kimberly Robinson. The woman who saved him was standing in his dealership, and his staff had mocked her, humiliated her, driven her away. "No," Albert whispered, his voice hoarse. Then louder. "Wait!" But Kimberly was already at the door, pushing it open, stepping into the sunlight. Albert's feet moved before his mind caught up. He strode forward quickly, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble. "Kimberly?" His voice echoed through the showroom, loud, commanding, impossible to ignore. The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Bonnie's smirk vanished. Marcus froze mid-laugh. Customers looked up from their phones. Kimberly stopped. Her hand was still on the door, halfway through leaving. Ava looked up at her mother, confused. Slowly, Kimberly turned around. Her eyes met Albert's across the showroom floor, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Albert's chest heaved. His eyes were wide, filled with disbelief and something deeper, something raw. Kimberly's brow furrowed. Her lips parted slightly. She didn't recognize him at first, not fully, not yet. But something in his face, in his eyes, in the way he was looking at her. Her breath hitched. "Do I—" she began, her voice uncertain. "Do I know you?" Albert took a step closer, his voice trembling. "It's me," he said quietly. "Albert Olson." Kimberly blinked. Her mind raced backward, searching through years of memories, faces, moments. And then it clicked. The young man on the highway, the broken-down car, the rain-soaked night. Her eyes widened. "Albert?" she whispered, disbelief flooding her voice. The mechanic?" He nodded slowly, a shaky smile breaking across his face. "I wasn't a mechanic," he said softly. "I was nobody. But you treated me like I was somebody." Tears welled in Kimberly's eyes. The room was utterly silent. Bonnie stood frozen, her face pale. Marcus's mouth hung open. Customers watched, transfixed, sensing they were witnessing something profound. Albert stepped closer, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, Kimberly." And in that moment, everything changed. Kimberly stopped mid-step. Her hand slipped from the door handle. Ava looked up at her, confused by the sudden halt, by the strange man calling her mother's name. Kimberly turned fully now, studying the man in the expensive suit. His face was older, more refined, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar that tugged at the edges of her memory. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, her voice uncertain. "Do I know you?" Albert's expression softened. The commanding presence he'd carried moments ago melted into something gentler, more vulnerable. He took another step closer, his hands falling to his sides. "You probably don't remember me," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I remember you." The staff exchanged puzzled looks. Bonnie shifted her weight nervously, glancing between Albert and Kimberly. Marcus leaned toward Tyler, whispering, "What's going on?" Tyler shrugged, equally confused. Customers watched in silence, sensing the shift in atmosphere but unable to place it. Bonnie forced a nervous laugh, stepping forward with a plastered-on smile. "Mr. Olson, I was just handling this situation." Albert's head snapped toward her, his eyes sharp. "Situation?" His voice cut through the air like a whip, making Bonnie flinch. "You mean Humiliating a customer in my showroom? Bonnie's face paled. She wasn't exactly enough. The single word thundered across the glass hall. Bonnie's mouth snapped shut. Marcus took a step back. The other employees stood frozen, their faces drained of color. Even the customers held their breath. Albert's gaze swept across the room, across every salesperson, every employee who had whispered, every person who had laughed. "Not another word," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not one." No one dared speak. Albert turned back to Kimberly, and the hardness in his expression dissolved instantly. His eyes softened. His shoulders dropped slightly. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but heavy with emotion. "Years ago," he began, his words measured, deliberate, "I was broke, completely broke. I had nothing, no job, no home, no hope." Kimberly's brow furrowed, listening intently. "I was sleeping in my car," Albert continued, his voice growing quieter, more personal. "Outside a diner on Route 9. It was winter, cold. I hadn't eaten in 2 days." He paused, his throat tightening. "You saw me." Kimberly's breath hitched. Something stirred in her memory, faint, distant, but there. "You were working the night shift," Albert said, his eyes glistening. "You came out during your break. You brought me food, a sandwich, hot coffee. You sat with me in the freezing cold and talked to me like I was a person, not trash." The memory surged forward now, clearer. A cold December night. The diner nearly empty. A young man sitting in a beaten-up Corolla in the parking lot, his head resting against the steering wheel. She'd seen him through the window, seen the exhaustion, the defeat, and she'd brought him food. Kimberly's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Gasps rippled through the staff. Bonnie's face went from pale to ashen. Marcus took another step back, as if trying to disappear into the wall. Albert nodded slowly, a trembling smile forming on his lips. "You told me something that night," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You said, everyone deserves a second chance. Don't let life convince you otherwise." Tears spilled down Kimberly's cheeks. "I remember," she breathed. "I remember you." She could see him now. The younger version, thinner, more desperate. The boy with kind eyes and no future. "You were trying to get to California," she said softly, the details flooding back. "You wanted to be a mechanic. You had a job interview lined up, but your car kept breaking down." Albert laughed, a wet, broken sound. "You gave me $50. You said it was for gas. I told you I couldn't take it, and you said—" "I said you could pay it forward one day," Kimberly finished, her voice trembling. Albert nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "I never forgot that, Kimberly. I never forgot you." The room was utterly silent. Albert took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I didn't make it to California," he said quietly. "The car broke down again. I took a job at a local garage instead. Worked my way up, saved every penny, learned the business." He gestured around the showroom, the gleaming cars, the polished floors, the luxury. "I built this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of this, and it started with you, with that one act of kindness." Kimberly shook her head in disbelief. "I didn't. I just gave you a meal." "No," Albert said firmly, stepping closer. "You gave me hope. You gave me dignity. You reminded me that I mattered. He paused, his jaw tightening. And now you walk into my dealership. His voice hardened, his gaze sweeping across the room. And my staff treat you like this? Bonnie looked like she might be sick. Marcus stared at the floor. Tyler's face burned with shame. Albert turned back to Kimberly, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry for what they did to you, for what they said. Kimberly wiped her tears, still holding Ava's hand tightly. The little girl watched the man in the suit with wide, curious eyes. You don't have to apologize, Kimberly said softly. You didn't know. But I should have, Albert said, his voice raw. This is my business, my responsibility, and I failed you. He looked down at Ava, his expression softening. And I'm sorry your daughter had to see that. Ava tilted her head, studying him. Why are you crying, mister? Albert smiled through his tears. Because your mommy is the kindest person I've ever met, and I forgot to tell the world. Kimberly let out a shaky laugh, overwhelmed and exhausted, and unable to process everything happening. Albert straightened, wiping his eyes. He looked at Kimberly with fierce determination. You saved me when I was nothing, he said, his voice steady now, resolute. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows what you did. The showroom remained silent. Every eye was on them, and for the first time since she'd walked through those glass doors, Kimberly didn't feel small. She felt seen. Albert straightened to his full height. The vulnerability from moments before hardened into something else, something commanding, unyielding. His jaw set, his eyes swept across the showroom with the authority of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. When he spoke, his voice didn't just carry. It echoed through the building like thunder. Every one of you owes this woman an apology. Right now. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. No one moved. The staff stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and terror. Customers stopped pretending to browse and openly stared. The jazz music playing overhead suddenly felt obscene, too casual for the gravity of the moment. Bonnie's face drained of every trace of color. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor spreading across her skin. Her hands trembled at her sides. Sir, I didn't know, she began, her voice small and desperate. That's the point. Albert's interruption was sharp, cutting through her excuse like a blade. He took a step toward her, his gaze unwavering. You judged her before knowing her story, he said, his voice cold and deliberate. Before seeing her heart. Before treating her like a human being. Bonnie opened her mouth, then closed it. No words came. Albert's gaze swept to Marcus, to Tyler, to every employee who had whispered, smirked, or stood by silently. All of you, he continued, his tone cutting. You saw a woman in modest clothes and assumed she had no value. You saw a little girl who wanted to look at cars and decided she didn't belong here. His voice rose, filling every corner of the showroom. You forgot the most basic principle of humanity, that dignity isn't bought with money. It's earned through character. Marcus stared at the floor, his face burning with shame. Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear. Even the receptionist who'd barely glanced at Kimberly earlier couldn't meet Albert's eyes. Kimberly stood frozen. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. Moments ago, she'd been walking out the door, humiliated and defeated. Now, she was standing in the center of the showroom, while the owner, the man she'd once helped, defended her in front of everyone. Her hands trembled. Her heart pounded. She didn't know whether to cry or laugh or run. Ava squeezed her mother's hand, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Mommy? What's happening?" Kimberly looked down at her daughter, her throat tight. "I don't know, baby," she whispered. Albert heard. His expression softened immediately. He turned away from his staff and approached Kimberly and Ava, his movements gentle, deliberate. When he reached them, he knelt down to Ava's height. The gesture was so unexpected, so humble, that several people in the room gasped softly. Here was the owner of a multi-million-dollar dealership, in his tailored suit and polished shoes, kneeling on the marble floor to speak to a 6-year-old girl. Ava looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Albert smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "do you know what your mom did for me?" Ava shook her head, her fingers still wrapped tightly around Kimberly's hand. Albert's smile deepened, though his eyes glistened with emotion. "Your mom helped me become who I am," he said softly. "A long time ago, when I had nothing, no home, no food, no hope, your mom was kind to me. She gave me something to eat. She talked to me. She made me feel like I mattered." Ava's eyes widened slightly. "She's the reason this place even exists," Albert continued, gesturing around the showroom. "All of these cars, this building, everything. It started because your mom believed in me when no one else did." Ava blinked in awe. She looked up at her mother, then back at Albert, trying to understand the magnitude of what he was saying. "My mommy did that?" she asked, her voice small and sweet. Albert nodded. "She did. Your mommy is a hero." Kimberly's tears spilled over. She covered her mouth with one hand, overwhelmed by the weight of his words, by the public vindication, by the sheer impossibility of this moment. Albert rose slowly, his gaze shifting back to Kimberly. His expression was filled with gratitude, respect, and something deeper, reverence. "You are the reason I'm here," he said quietly, his voice meant for her but loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I will never forget that." The employees stood in stunned silence. Bonnie's face had gone from pale to red, her eyes brimming with unshed tears of shame. She wanted to apologize, to take back every cruel word, but her voice wouldn't come. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Tyler stared at Kimberly with wide, horrified eyes, realizing the depth of what they'd done. The customers watched in absolute silence. Some looked moved. Others looked ashamed for having judged Kimberly themselves. A few wiped at their eyes, touched by the unexpected display of gratitude and humility. For the first time since walking through those glass doors, Kimberly wasn't invisible. She wasn't ignored. She wasn't mocked. She was seen. She was respected. She was honored. Albert turned back to his staff, his voice firm but quieter now. "I built this dealership on hard work and integrity," he said. "But none of it means anything if we forget where we came from, if we forget how to treat people with kindness." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We are better than this," he said. "And if we're not, then we don't deserve to be here." Bonnie finally found her voice, though it came out cracked and broken. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes on Kimberly. "I'm so sorry." Marcus nodded, his face filled with regret. "We were wrong. Completely wrong." Tyler stepped forward, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." One by one, the employees apologized. Some spoke loudly. Some could barely get the words out. But each apology hung in the air like a confession, a reckoning. Kimberly didn't know what to say. She nodded gently, accepting their words even as her mind reeled. Ava tugged at her mother's dress. "Mommy, are they sorry for being mean?" Kimberly knelt down, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Yes, baby, they are." Ava tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's good. It's good to say sorry." The innocence of her words cut deeper than any rebuke. Even Bonnie flinched, the simplicity of a child's wisdom exposing the ugliness of what they'd done. Albert smiled softly at Ava, then looked around the room one last time. "Let this be a lesson," he said quietly. "Not just for today, but for every day. We never know who we're standing in front of. We never know what someone has done, what they've survived, or what they're capable of." He turned back to Kimberly, his voice warm. "And sometimes," he said, "the person we least expect is the one who saves us." Albert stood and turned to face his staff. His expression had softened, but his voice still carried the weight of authority, the kind that demanded attention without needing to be loud. "There's one more thing," he said. The employees straightened, uncertain what was coming next. Albert's gaze swept across them, then settled back on Ava, the little girl in the orange dress who'd been mocked for touching a car, who'd asked her mother if they'd done something bad. His voice rang clear across the showroom. "Let her daughter pick anything she wants from the showroom. No charge." The crowd murmured. Gasps rippled through the staff. Customers exchanged stunned glances. Even Kimberly's eyes widened in disbelief. "Albert, no!" she began, shaking her head. "That's too much. You don't have to—" "I want to," Albert interrupted gently, his eyes kind but firm. "Please, let me do this." Kimberly opened her mouth to protest again, but the words caught in her throat. Ava's small voice broke through. "Anything?" She looked up at Albert with wide, hopeful eyes, eyes that had been dimmed by cruelty just minutes ago, but were now sparkling with wonder. Albert knelt down again, meeting her at eye level. His smile was warm and genuine. "Anything," he confirmed. Ava's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. She looked at her mother for permission. Kimberly's eyes were already welling with tears, but she managed a nod, unable to speak. "Go ahead, baby," Kimberly whispered. Ava took her first tentative step forward. Her small footsteps echoed across the marble floor, a sound that had once carried shame and now carried possibility. The showroom watched in complete silence. Bonnie held her breath. Marcus stood frozen. Tyler couldn't take his eyes off the little girl. Ava walked slowly past the gleaming vehicles, her head tilted back to take them all in. She paused at the red Ferrari she'd touched earlier, the one that had gotten her scolded. She looked at it for a long moment, her small hand hovering near the hood, then pulled back. She moved on. Past the Porsche, past the Bentley, past the Range Rover her mother had admired. Customers leaned in, curious to see what a 6-year-old would choose when offered anything in a luxury dealership. Albert watched with quiet anticipation. Kimberly pressed a hand to her chest, her heart full and breaking at the same time. Ava wandered toward the display counter near the entrance, the one with dealership merchandise, accessories, and branded items. Her eyes scanned the shelves, model cars, leather keychains, expensive driving gloves, crystal ornaments. And then she stopped. Her gaze landed on a small display hook near the bottom shelf. Hanging there was a simple silver keychain with a tiny car charm. no bigger than her thumb. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even prominently displayed. But it caught the light just right, glinting softly. Ava reached out and picked it up gently, cradling it in her small palm as if it were made of glass. She turned it over, watching the way it shimmered. Then she turned back to her mother, her face glowing with pure, uncomplicated joy. "This one's perfect, Mommy," Kimberly blinked, confused. "Baby, you can pick anything. A toy car, a jacket, anything you want." Ava shook her head, holding up the keychain with both hands like an offering. "This one's perfect," she repeated, her voice soft but certain. "It's small but shiny." Kimberly's eyes welled up. She walked over and knelt beside her daughter, taking the keychain in her hands. It was so light, so simple, worth maybe $10 at most. "Sweetheart," Kimberly whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you sure you don't want something bigger?" Ava shook her head, her expression earnest. "This is enough," she said simply. The simplicity of her choice silenced the room. Bonnie's hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Marcus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of what they'd almost stolen from this child. Not the chance to own something expensive, but the chance to feel valued. Tyler wiped at his eyes quickly, turning away. Even the customers stood in reverent silence, moved by the purity of the moment. Albert walked over slowly, his hands in his pockets, his eyes glistening. He looked down at the little keychain in Ava's hands, then at the girl herself, her worn sandals, her bright orange dress, her face full of simple contentment. And he smiled. Not the polite smile of a businessman, not the practiced smile of someone used to putting on appearances. A real smile, deep and genuine, and full of something like wonder. "She's just like you," he said softly, his voice meant for Kimberly. Kimberly looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "She doesn't need much," Kimberly whispered. "She never has. She just wants to be happy." Albert nodded, his throat tight. "That's what you taught me," he said quietly. "That happiness doesn't come from what you have. It comes from who you are." He looked back at Ava, who was now admiring the keychain, holding it up to the light, and giggling softly at the way it sparkled. "You raised an incredible little girl," Albert said. Kimberly's voice broke. "I'm trying." "You're succeeding." Albert turned to one of his employees, a younger woman named Claire, who'd stayed silent throughout the ordeal, shame written across her face. "Claire, can you wrap that for her?" Albert asked gently. "Make it special." Claire nodded quickly, relieved to have something to do, something to make amends for. "Yes, sir." "Absolutely." She took the keychain carefully from Ava's hands and disappeared behind the counter. Ava watched her go, then looked up at Albert. "Thank you, mister," she said, her voice small but sincere. Albert knelt down one more time, his eyes level with hers. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "Thank you. You just reminded all of us what really matters." Ava tilted her head, not fully understanding, but she smiled anyway, the kind of pure, unguarded smile only children can give. Claire returned moments later with the keychain wrapped in delicate tissue paper and placed in a small velvet pouch with the dealership's logo embossed in gold. She handed it to Ava with both hands, her eyes red. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered. "For earlier, I should have been kinder." Ava looked at her, then at the pouch, then back at Claire. "It's okay," Ava said simply. Everyone makes mistakes. The words, spoken with such innocent wisdom, broke something open in the room. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, nodding, unable to speak. Ava clutched the velvet pouch to her chest like it was the greatest treasure in the world. And in that moment, it was. Albert straightened, his gaze sweeping across the showroom. The moment with Ava had softened something in the atmosphere, but he wasn't finished. Not yet. He turned to face his senior staff, Bonnie, Marcus, Tyler, Claire, and the others who held positions of influence in the dealership. His expression was calm, but resolute. "Senior staff," he said, his voice carrying authority. "Here, now." They hesitated for only a moment, before moving forward, forming a semicircle around him. Their faces were still marked with shame. Uncertainty about what was coming next. Albert addressed them right there in front of everyone. Customers still lingered, unwilling to leave. The moment felt too significant, too raw to walk away from. "This dealership was built on hard work," Albert began, his voice firm but not harsh. "I started with nothing. I worked 18-hour days. I slept in the back office. I scrubbed floors and answered phones and did whatever it took to make this place succeed." The staff nodded, some of them knowing the stories, others hearing the depth of it for the first time. "But hard work alone didn't build this place," Albert continued, his tone intensifying. "It was built on kindness, on the belief that every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, deserves dignity." He paused, letting the words settle. "If we ever forget where we came from, we lose everything that matters." Bonnie's head lowered. Marcus shifted his weight, unable to meet Albert's eyes. Albert's gaze softened slightly, though his words remained pointed. "I didn't build this business to create a place where people feel small," he said. "I built it to prove that success doesn't have to come at the cost of humanity." He looked around the room, at the employees, at the customers, at the gleaming cars that represented wealth and status. "None of this means anything if we treat people like they're invisible, if we judge them by their clothes instead of their character." Tyler nodded slowly, the weight of the lesson sinking in. Claire wiped at her eyes again, her face full of regret and resolve. Albert turned to Kimberly. She stood beside Ava, still holding her daughter's hand, still processing everything that had unfolded. "You once told me something," Albert said, his voice softer now, more personal. "A long time ago, when I was at my lowest." Kimberly's breath hitched, remembering. "You said, 'Everyone deserves a second chance.'" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Albert took a step closer, his expression earnest. "I'd like to offer you one now." Kimberly blinked, confused. I don't understand." Albert smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We're launching a community outreach program," he explained. "A program to help people who are struggling. People who need a hand up, not a handout. People who deserve to be seen." Kimberly's eyes widened. "And I want you to lead it." The words landed like thunder. Kimberly's mouth fell open. Her hand flew to her chest. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Albert, I can't." "You can," Albert interrupted gently but firmly. "You're exactly the person for this. You understand what it's like to struggle. You understand what kindness means when you have nothing. And you understand how to see people, really see them." Kimberly shook her head, overwhelmed. But I don't have experience with— You have the most important experience, Albert said. You have a heart that sees worth in people when everyone else looks away. The crowd broke into applause. It started with one person, a customer near the back, and spread like wildfire. Staff members joined in, their clapping tentative at first, then stronger. Even Bonnie applauded, tears streaming down her face. Kimberly covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She couldn't speak, couldn't process. The shift from humiliation to honor was too vast, too sudden. Ava looked up at her mother, her small face glowing with pride. "Mommy, what's happening?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Kimberly knelt down, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. "Something good, baby," she whispered through tears. "Something really, really good." Ava beamed, clutching her velvet pouch. "I knew it would be okay, Mommy." Kimberly laughed, a wet, broken, beautiful sound. She looked up at Albert, her eyes red and grateful and disbelieving all at once. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Albert extended his hand. "Say you'll do it," he said simply. Kimberly stared at his hand, the hand of the man she'd once helped, now offering her something she never could have imagined. Slowly, she reached out and took it. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll do it." The applause intensified. Customers cheered. Staff members nodded in approval, some wiping at their own eyes. Albert pulled Kimberly gently to her feet, still holding her hand. "You taught me compassion," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me that people matter more than profit, that kindness is never wasted." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, across his staff, his customers, the empire he'd built. "It's time the world learns it from you." Kimberly stood in the center of the showroom, no longer invisible, no longer judged. She was seen. She was valued. She was honored. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she mattered. Ava tugged at her dress, smiling up at her. "Mommy, are you happy?" Kimberly knelt down, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. "Yes, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so happy." Ava giggled, holding up her velvet pouch. "Me too. I got a treasure." Kimberly laughed through her tears, pulling Ava into another hug. Albert watched them, his own eyes glistening. This was why he'd built the dealership. Not for the cars, not for the wealth, not for the status, but for moments like this, for the chance to give back, for the opportunity to prove that kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. Bonnie approached hesitantly, her face still red, her voice shaking. "Ms. Robinson," she began, her words tumbling out quickly. I need you to know how sorry I am. I was cruel. I was wrong. And I'll do better. I promise." Kimberly looked at her, this young woman who'd mocked her, humiliated her, tried to drive her away. And she saw something there. Not malice, just ignorance, immaturity, a lack of understanding. Kimberly nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes," she said softly. "What matters is what we do after." Bonnie's face crumpled. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being kinder than I deserve." Marcus stepped forward next, his voice low and sincere. "I'm sorry too," he said. "I let it happen. I participated. That makes me just as guilty." Kimberly met his eyes. "Then learn from it. Teach others. Make sure it doesn't happen again. Marcus nodded firmly. I will. I swear. One by one, the staff approached, each with their own apology, each with their own resolve to be better, and Kimberly accepted each one with grace. Albert stood back, watching it all unfold. This was redemption, not just for Kimberly, who'd been wronged, not just for his staff, who'd failed, but for all of them. Because kindness, when given the chance, could heal, it could transform, it could redeem. Albert smiled to himself, remembering the young man he used to be, broken, hopeless, invisible. And he remembered the woman who'd seen him. Now the world would see her too. The moment had finally come to leave. But this time, everything was different. Kimberly held Ava's hand as they moved toward the glass doors, the same doors they'd walked through less than an hour ago, bracing themselves against judgment. Now they walked with their heads held high. The staff lined the path to the exit, not because they were ordered to, not because protocol demanded it, but because something fundamental had shifted inside each of them. Marcus stood near the SUV display, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression solemn and respectful. Tyler positioned himself by the Ferrari, the car Ava had touched with innocent wonder. He nodded as they passed, his eyes still red. Claire stood near the entrance, clutching a tissue, managing a small, tearful smile. And Bonnie stood directly by the door. The same woman who'd mocked Kimberly's clothes, who'd suggested security, who'd delivered that final, cutting remark about dreams being free. Now she stood with her head slightly bowed, her glossy confidence stripped away, replaced with something raw and humbled. As Kimberly approached, Bonnie stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, pulling it open slowly. The morning sunlight spilled into the showroom, warm and golden. Bonnie's voice came out barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. 2 words, small, insufficient for the cruelty she'd inflicted. But they were honest. Kimberly stopped. She looked at Bonnie, really looked at her. Saw the young woman beneath the sharp suit and sharper words. Saw someone who'd made a terrible mistake and would have to live with it. Kimberly's expression softened. I hope you treat the next person better, she said gently. Not with anger, not with bitterness, with grace. Bonnie's eyes filled with tears. She nodded quickly, unable to speak. Kimberly gave her one more look, not of forgiveness exactly, but of understanding, and then stepped through the door. Outside, the world felt different. The morning sun glinted off the rows of luxury cars in the lot, the Bentleys, the Porsches, the Ferraris, all gleaming like jewels under the clear sky. The air smelled fresh, clean, full of possibility. Ava skipped beside her mother, her orange dress swaying, her small hand clutching the velvet pouch like it contained the most precious treasure in the world. She looked up at the cars, then at the dealership behind them, then at her mother. Mommy, she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. One day, can we have a car like that? Kimberly stopped walking. She knelt down, bringing herself to Ava's eye level. She brushed a curl from her daughter's face, her heart swelling with love and pride. Yes, baby, Kimberly said, her voice steady and sure. One day, we will. Ava's eyes lit up. Really? Really, Kimberly confirmed. But only if we never forget who we are. Ava tilted her head, thinking, Who are we, Mommy? Kimberly smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. We're people who are kind, she said softly. who help others, who don't need fancy things to feel valuable. She tapped the velvet pouch gently. We're people who know that the smallest gift can be the most precious, because it's given with love. Ava nodded seriously, absorbing the words like a solemn promise. "I'll remember, Mommy," she said. "I know you will, sweetheart." Kimberly kissed her daughter's forehead, then stood, taking Ava's hand again. Together, they walked toward the parking lot, toward Kimberly's old sedan, with the dented bumper and the fading paint. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And today, that was enough. Inside, Albert stood at the glass doors, hands in his pockets. He watched Kimberly and Ava walk away, two figures bathed in morning sunlight, moving with quiet dignity. The staff had dispersed, returning to their stations, but the atmosphere had changed. Something heavy had lifted. Something important had been learned. Bonnie stood beside him, still wiping at her eyes. "Mr. Olson," she began hesitantly, I don't know how to make this right." Albert didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Kimberly. "You make it right by never doing it again," he said quietly. "By remembering how you felt today. By treating every person who walks through those doors like they matter." Bonnie nodded, her throat tight. "I will. I promise." Albert finally turned to her. His expression wasn't angry. It was tired, sad, but also hopeful. "Good," he said simply. "Because this business isn't about cars, Bonnie. It's about people. And if we forget that, we've lost everything." Bonnie nodded again, the weight of his words settling deep. Albert turned back to the glass. Kimberly was helping Ava into the back seat of her car now, buckling her in, making sure she was safe and secure. The little girl held up her keychain through the window, showing it to her mother one more time, and both of them laughed. Albert's chest tightened. He remembered that night so clearly now, the rain, the cold, the hopelessness. He remembered Kimberly's face as she handed him food, her voice as she told him he mattered. "Some debts," he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible, "aren't paid in money." Marcus approached from behind, clearing his throat. "Sir, the morning meeting—" "Cancel it," Albert said softly, not looking away from the window. Marcus hesitated. "Sir?" "Cancel it," Albert repeated. "I need a moment." Marcus nodded and stepped away, understanding. Outside, Kimberly climbed into the driver's seat. She sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the dealership through the windshield. So much had changed in the span of an hour. She'd walked in invisible, dismissed, humiliated. She was leaving seen, valued, honored. But more than that, she had purpose. A job. A chance to help others the way she'd once helped a young man on the side of the road. A chance to make a difference. She started the engine, the old car sputtering to life, and pulled out of the parking lot. Ava waved at the dealership from the back seat, her keychain catching the light. "Bye, Mr. Albert," she called, even though he couldn't hear her. Kimberly smiled, her heart full. Albert raised his hand slowly, waving back, even though he knew they couldn't see. He watched until the car disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the Saturday morning traffic. And then he stood there, silent, reflecting. The dealership would go on. Cars would be sold. Deals would be made. Life would continue. But it would be different now. Because everyone inside had learned something today. That dignity isn't bought. That kindness costs nothing but means everything. that every person who walks through those doors carries a story and deserves to be treated with respect. Albert exhaled slowly, a small smile forming on his lips. "Thank you, Kimberly," he whispered to the empty air. The story closed with Kimberly driving away in her old dented sedan. Not rich in possessions, not draped in luxury, but rich in purpose, rich in dignity, rich in the knowledge that she mattered, that she'd always mattered, and that her kindness had built something beautiful, even when she didn't know it. Behind her, Olson Luxury Motors stood gleaming in the sunlight, a dealership forever changed, not by wealth, not by status, but by the kindness of one single mother who had once stopped to help a stranger in the rain. And that kindness, like all true kindness, had come full circle.